only right and proper that she and her family gets the help and support that they need. And I wish to God the medical world would sit up and take responsibility and help people like her, help people like me. I've had other people who have also messaged me and said virtually the same thing, that seeing me on your show saved their lives.
We hopefully have got Mr. Elton again, Colin Elton, who is a surgeon who uses mesh. You may not have heard David's last comment, which was that he wishes the medical community would take responsibility for this. Why is mesh being sewn into humans when they've only been tested, in some cases, on rabbits for 5 days?
So, can you hear me now?
I can, yes, thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me onto the programme and giving a chance for me to talk. So I quite agree with your comments on face value, and obviously completely sympathise with all the patients that have had either chronic pain or have had complications following any surgery. And I agree with one of your guests who said that actually, you know, as the Hippocratic Oath says, first of all, don't do no harm. And it's actually one of the surgeon's, you know, primary aims is actually to make things better, never to do any harm. And it saddens anybody as a surgeon when this does occur. But I think in context, you need to also understand about the number of hernia repairs that are done in this country and worldwide. And it is a vast number, and the vast majority of them are done with mesh. They do go through testing, and they do go through trials and studies, and there are actually now studies over a period of about 30 years about meshes of different types in different situations.
Yeah, but the international guidelines say that 10% of people with mesh will suffer chronic pain.
I quite agree.
So you agree, and?
So I quite agree. Then you have to look at the alternatives. So if we're not going to use meshes, what can we use? So let's take one of the hernia repairs. We talk about groin hernias.
Before we do that, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Elton. So
Sorry.
If 1 million people have hernia mesh, 100,000 of them will suffer chronic pain. Do you think that's acceptable?
No, as a percentage, it's very high. But of those 10%, you can actually differentiate between those patients who are suffering quite severe pain and affecting their life, which is a much smaller percentage of the 10%. So chronic pain has a variety of symptoms, including altered sensation, including the occasional electric shock, a bit of discomfort, to the whole range, to the severe pain that some of your patients are complaining of, where it's affecting their life and having to give up work. That's a much smaller percentage, but definitely significant. And because, as Dave said, it's ruined their lives.
Why is that a risk worth paying?
So again, if we say that we're going to ban all meshes, we have to have an alternative. And I quite agree with one of your earlier comments, which I tried to answer, but I think we had very poor communication in the fact that we shouldn't be having 100 different meshes, and that we are almost at the whim of companies who will sell and will go and say, yes, that's a very good one, that's the latest one, that's the one we want to use. I quite agree that we've got to be much more rigorous in the information that comes from the companies, standardise such that if we're going to use a mesh, that we use the same one that's completely agreed and it's gone through all various different testing, agreed through the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And it also depends upon the conditions. So surgeons need to understand which hernia repairs they need to use, which meshes, and when to use a mesh. Okay, so there's many instances of hernia repairs where you don't need to use a mesh. And there are other alternatives which are very, very sensible. And in some instances where you need to use a mesh, you don't need to use something that's permanent.
Yeah, but sadly not all surgeons are following best practice necessarily. I want to introduce you to Jacqueline, if I may. Jacqueline, do talk to Colin Elton and tell him what difference having a hernia mesh has made to your life.
Well, it's changed my life completely. I went from running a very successful business, travelling around the UK, the States and Europe, to now being able to just work a few hours a week from home. Over a period of time, I've got increasing joint pain, chronic fatigue. It's not just about pain at the site of the mesh, although I'm getting that too, and that's increasing as the mesh is aging. I have difficulty standing, difficulty sitting, difficulty walking, even laying in bed at night is not comfortable. What I want to know is, where is your crystal ball that says whether this operation is going to be successful or not? Nobody told me that there were any risks whatsoever to this. I would absolutely categorically not have agreed to having mesh if I knew what my life was going to be like following mesh. And it's just getting worse and worse. And there are alternatives, because before we had mesh, surgeons were able to repair hernias quite successfully. It's not the only way, but it is causing devastating harm to patients. And now I'm left in a situation 12 years later where I'm still being told by surgeons. I was referred just last year to a hernia consultant who said to me, categorically, hernia mesh does not cause problems. It does not cause joint pain, it does not go brittle, it does not move, it does not release toxins.
Let Mr. Elton respond. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Elton.
First of all, I completely sympathise, and I'm sorry to hear that you've suffered in the way that you have. Any foreign body that enters any foreign body that enters our body, we can react against. It doesn't have to be just mesh, it can be anything. There was the case of the breast prosthesis. There's so many other prostheses that can enter our body and that we can react against. And I think it's really important that the surgeon does give the patient the information that they need to have in order to make a decision, informed consent about what type of surgery they want, and also whether they do want a mesh or not. And I have to tell you, I'm really sorry to hear that you didn't receive that information. I will always tell patients that there is, on average, a 10% risk of having chronic pain, and I explain that in great detail. Interestingly,
can I just ask about that 10%? Because nobody has ever followed me up. I suspect the figure is much, much higher, because I know lots of other people with mesh that have had problems, whose surgeons, GPs, specialists, consultants, whoever they visit, are still in denial. So there is no national audit, there is no recall like there would be if this was a washing machine. Nobody is asking us what problems we're having. I'm not on any database to say I've had problems. And, how many people are out there perhaps watching this programme today thinking, hang on, I've got all those symptoms, I didn't put it down to mesh. I didn't put it down to mesh for many, many years. It was only when I started to acquire more and more autoimmune diseases and started to read up on them that I started to realise it was all about toxicity.
Okay. And I could see, sorry to interrupting, Jackie. David, I could see you as you were listening to Colin Elton. You look very emotional as you're hearing him talk about mesh and the reasons why he uses it, and points to the fact that many, 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 many millions of people have mesh repairs and they are successful. There is no particular pain. What would you like to say to him?
Well, I heard his comments on the 10% of people that suffer the complications, but only a minority suffer chronic pain. How's he measuring that? How's he getting his figures there? Because as the ladies just previously said, she's not been monitored, she's not been asked, and neither have I. So how's he getting that information to quote it live on national television? I'd like to know where he's getting his information from, because I would like to look at it.
Can I respond?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. So I quite agree with one of your earlier comments that we probably don't know the full extent of this percentage, because you're absolutely right. There will be quite a number of patients who will have the occasional, as I mentioned to you, occasional bit of discomfort, and probably just put it down to either a bit of post-operative pain, or just like most people do, they just get on with their lives. But you're not really talking about that. You're talking about the much more severe cases, which I completely understand. And I completely recognise to this gentleman that he's not, it's not been discussed with him, he's not been audited. I think what I'm talking about is the world literature. So when we're talking about several thousands of patients who, just like in any poll, any survey, are surveyed, and those are the papers that that as clinicians and as scientists, we report and we mention. But you're quite right. Okay. There isn't a national audit. There should be, and I quite agree. Just like with any foreign object, particularly in view of the recent problems with pelvic meshes, I think we should have a national audit which allows all patients to explain their symptoms. Okay. To and it, you know, it will also not just allow that to happen, but actually that somebody's actually listening to them and nobody's actually fobbing them off, because I quite agree, it's very, very easy to be fobbed off, and I'm sorry to hear that you have.
Okay. I want to bring in Barbara, if I may, to ask about your husband. Tell us a little